Good evening. Tonight, we descend into a world where honor and brutality danced together on blood-soaked battlefields, where the clash of steel decided the fate of empires, and where death was preferable to dishonor. This is the story of the samurai, Japan's legendary warrior class, whose battles were so fierce, so strategic, and so utterly unforgiving that they would reshape an entire civilization. From the mist-covered plains of Sekigahara to the burning walls of Osaka Castle, we will witness the rise and fall of warriors who lived by the sword and died by codes that demanded everything, including their lives. Before we march into this theater of war, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. The samurai believed that battles fought at dawn carried the blessing of the rising sun, while those under the moon were touched by the spirits of the ancestors. Are you watching as the sun climbs or as shadows fall? And if these tales of steel, strategy, and sacrifice stir something in your warrior's heart, hit that subscribe button. We bring you the untold stories of history's most disciplined killers, their victories carved in blood, their defeats written in honor, and their legends that refuse to die. In the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient Japan, long before the world knew the terror of the samurai blade, a transformation was taking place that would birth the most disciplined, most feared warrior class in human history. The year was 794, and the Heian period had just begun. The imperial court in Kyoto lived in luxury and poetry while the countryside burned with the conflicts of ambitious clans, hungry for power and land. It was in this crucible of constant warfare that the samurai were forged, not born from noble blood or divine mandate, but hammered into existence by necessity, violence, and an uncompromising will to survive in a world where weakness meant death and hesitation meant the extinction of your entire bloodline. The word samurai itself comes from the verb saboro, meaning to serve. But these were no ordinary servants. These were men who served with the edge of a blade, who pledged their lives not just to their lords, but to a code that would make them legendary and ultimately destroy them. They began as horse-riding archers, provincial warriors hired to settle disputes and protect the interests of the great families. But as the central government weakened and regional conflicts intensified, these warriors evolved into something far more dangerous. Picture the early samurai, not yet the armored legends we know from later centuries, but hardened fighters on horseback, their bows singing death across rice fields turned into killing grounds. They fought not for abstract concepts of honor, but for survival, for the right to keep their families alive in a land where civil war was as regular as the changing seasons. Their battles were small, personal affairs, clan against clan, brother against brother, with stakes that couldn't be higher. The Genpei War of 1180 to 1185 marked the bloody birth of samurai supremacy. This was not just a conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans. It was a cataclysmic struggle that would determine whether the old aristocratic order would survive, or whether a new age of warrior rule would dawn. The battles of this war were exercises in tactical brilliance and breathtaking savagery. At the Battle of Kurakara Pass in 1183, Minamoto no Yoshinaka employed a strategy so cunning and brutal that it became legend. Facing a larger Taira force in a narrow mountain pass, Yoshinaka waited until nightfall, then drove a herd of oxen with burning torches tied to their horns directly into the enemy camp. The terrified animals, mad with pain and fear, trampled through the Taira ranks while Yoshinaka's warriors struck from multiple directions. The screams of dying men, mixed with the bellowing of wounded beasts, created a hellscape that survivors would remember until their dying day. By morning, the pass was choked with corpses, and the Taira forces were shattered. But it was at Dan-Nura in 1185 where the true nature of samurai warfare revealed itself. This naval battle would end the Genpei War and establish principles that would define samurai combat for centuries. The Minamoto fleet, led by Yoshitsune, faced the Taira in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu. What followed was not just a battle, but a masterclass in tactical adaptation and psychological warfare. Yoshitsune had studied his enemies, learnt their weaknesses, and prepared for this moment with the cold calculation of a predator. When the battle began, the Taira initially held the advantage. Their ships were better positioned, their archers more numerous. But Yoshitsune had turned local fishermen into allies, men who knew these waters like the lines on their weathered hands. As the tide turned, literally and figuratively, so did the battle's momentum. The Minamoto archers began targeting not the armored warriors, but the helmsmen and rowers, the unarmored men whose deaths would leave the great ships helpless in the treacherous currents. Ship after ship lost control, drifting into range of Minamoto vessels where samurai warriors leaped aboard with their curved swords drawn, ready to settle matters with steel and blood. The final moments of Dan-Yura became the stuff of legend and tragedy. Rather than face capture and the shame that would follow, the Taira chose death. The emperor's grandmother, carrying the sacred sword that was one of Japan's 3 imperial treasures, walked into the sea with the 8-year-old Emperor Antoku in her arms. "In the depths of the ocean is our capital," she said, and disappeared beneath the waves. Dozens of Taira warriors followed, choosing honor in death over life in defeat. This moment crystallized what would become the samurai's defining characteristic, the willingness, even eagerness, to die rather than live with dishonor. But Dan-Yura also demonstrated their tactical brilliance, their ability to adapt and exploit enemy weaknesses, and their understanding that victory often came not to the strongest but to the most prepared and most ruthless. With the Minamoto victory at Dan-Yura, Japan entered the age of the warrior. But these were not mindless killers or simple soldiers. Over the next centuries, the samurai would develop a code of conduct so rigid, so demanding, and so intertwined with concepts of death that it would transform them into something unique in human history. Warriors who fought not just to win, but to achieve a perfect death. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not created in a single moment or codified by a single writer. It evolved through centuries of warfare, philosophy, and the brutal practical experience of men who lived every day knowing that death was not just possible but likely. By the Kamakura period, this code had crystallized into a set of principles that governed every aspect of a samurai's existence: rectitude, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. But these were not abstract concepts debated in peaceful halls. They were principles proven in the crucible of battle, where a moment's hesitation could mean death, where loyalty was measured by the willingness to die for your lord, and where courage was demonstrated not by surviving, but by how beautifully you met your end. The concept of seppuku, ritual suicide, became the ultimate expression of samurai values. This was not simply taking one's own life. It was a carefully choreographed ceremony that transformed death into art, disgrace into honor, and defeat into victory. A samurai performing seppuku would dress in white, the color of death and purity, compose death poems that captured his final thoughts, then use his wakizashi, his short sword, to cut open his own belly in a precise horizontal line. The pain was excruciating, the death slow and agonizing. But this was precisely the point. A samurai's final moments were his opportunity to demonstrate complete mastery over fear, pain, and the desire to live. The ritual was often completed by a kishakunin, a second who would decapitate the dying warrior at the moment of greatest agony, sparing him the final indignity of crying out or losing composure. But even this mercy required perfect timing and skill, for to strike too early robbed the warrior of his chance to prove his courage. while two strike too late allowed dishonor to creep in through displays of weakness. These beliefs shaped how samurai approached battle. They did not fight primarily to survive. They fought to demonstrate their worthiness to die. This paradox created warriors of terrifying effectiveness because men who had already accepted death, who even welcomed it under the right circumstances, fought with a ferocity and recklessness that few enemies could match. The katana, the samurai sword, became both weapon and soul. The forging of a katana was itself a spiritual process. Master swordsmiths would purify themselves with ritual baths, abstain from sex and alcohol, and pray to the kami, the spirits, throughout the forging process. The blade was folded hundreds of times, creating layers of steel that gave it flexibility and hardness in perfect balance. The result was more than a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of the samurai's spirit. A samurai's relationship with his sword was intensely personal. He named it, talked to it, slept with it beside him, and considered it as much a part of himself as his arms or his heart. To lose one's sword in battle was a disgrace worse than wounds or even death. There are records of samurai fighting on with broken swords, using the shattered blade as a dagger, rather than abandon their spiritual partner. The testing of a new blade often involved cutting through condemned criminals or corpses, but master swordsmen could evaluate a blade's quality by its performance against specific targets. The finest swords could cut cleanly through multiple bodies with a single stroke, slice through armor as if it was silk, or split a single hair dropped onto the blade. These were not just weapons, but works of art that happened to be capable of dealing death with surgical precision. But the samurai arsenal extended far beyond the katana. The yumi, the Japanese longbow, was the primary weapon of mounted samurai for centuries. These were not the small, weak bows of medieval Europe, but massive weapons nearly as tall as a man, capable of driving arrows through armor at distances that would astound modern archers. A master archer could loose arrows with such speed and accuracy that enemies would find themselves dead before they heard the bowstring sing. The naginata, a curved blade mounted on a long wooden shaft, became the preferred weapon of warrior monks and some samurai infantry. In skilled hands, a naginata could cut down mounted warriors, sweep the legs from charging enemies, or create a defensive barrier that few could penetrate. The weapon required not just strength, but perfect timing and spatial awareness, for a wielder had to judge distances precisely to bring the blade to bear, while keeping enemies outside the range of their shorter weapons. Perhaps most terrifying was the kanabo, a massive iron club studded with spikes or flanges. This was not a weapon of finesse, but of brutal, overwhelming force. A single blow from a kanabo could crush armor, shatter bones, and send even the strongest warrior flying through the air. Warriors who specialized in the kanabo were often giants among men, fighters whose physical strength was matched only by their willingness to close to the deadly range where such weapons were effective. The samurai did not fight as individuals, but as part of sophisticated military units that combined different weapons and tactics into deadly harmonious wholes. A typical samurai charge would begin with mounted archers loosing volley after volley into enemy ranks, followed by spear-armed ashigaru foot soldiers who would create gaps in the enemy line, and finally the samurai themselves with their swords, fighting individual combats that were as much about personal honor as military objectives. The morning mist clung to the valley like the breath of ghosts as two armies prepared to decide the fate of Japan. October 15th, 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara. In a few short hours, this narrow valley would become a charnel house that would end one age and birth another, settling a struggle for power that had torn the nation apart and establishing a peace that would last for over 2 centuries. On the western ridge, Ishida Mitsunari's forces spread like a crescent moon across the mountainside. 80,000 warriors strong, they held the higher ground, the better position, and what many considered the more legitimate claim to rule Japan. Mitsunari fought for the memory of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the great unifier who had died 2 years earlier, leaving behind only a young son and a collection of ambitious retainers, who could not trust each other enough to preserve what their master had built. In the eastern valley, Tokugawa Ieyasu's armies stretched across the plain, their banners snapping in the cold wind. 75,000 men, but these were warriors who had chosen their master carefully. Men who believed that Ieyasu offered not just victory but stability, order, and an end to the decades of civil war that had turned Japan into a landscape of burned cities and broken dreams. But numbers and positions tell only part of the story. The real Battle of Sekigahara was fought in the days and weeks before the armies ever met, in the shadowy world of negotiation, betrayal, and political maneuvering that would prove more decisive than any charge of armored cavalry or volley of arrows. Ieyasu had spent months cultivating allies, making promises, offering rewards, and subtly threatening those who might oppose him. His agents had spread through the Western army like poison in wine, whispering doubts, offering better terms, and reminding powerful daimyo that backing the losing side in a civil war meant not just death, but the extinction of their entire lineage. By the morning of the battle, half of the Western army was already committed to betraying their nominal allies. Kobayaka Hideaki commanded 15,000 men on Mount Matsuo, positioned perfectly to strike the Eastern army's flank. But Hideaki had already met secretly with Ieyasu's representatives, had already agreed to switch sides at the crucial moment. His warriors prepared for battle, sharpened their weapons, and said their prayers, not knowing that their lord had already sold them to their enemies. As the sun rose and burned away the morning mist, the two armies began their deadly dance. The battle opened with the thunderous boom of arquebus fire, the smoke from hundreds of matchlock muskets drifting across the valley like morning fog. These were relatively new weapons in Japan, introduced by Portuguese traders barely 50 years earlier. But Japanese smiths had quickly mastered their manufacture, and samurai armies had learned to integrate firepower with traditional weapons in devastating combinations. The first charge came from the Western forces. Yukita Heidi's division, 30,000 strong, crashed into Fukushima Masanori's eastern troops like a avalanche of steel and fury. For a moment, it seemed the Western army might carry the day through sheer momentum. Samurai warriors, their armor gleaming in the morning sun, their war cries echoing off the surrounding mountains, threw themselves into combat with the reckless abandon that had made them legendary. But this was not a battle that would be won by individual courage or superior swordsmanship. This was modern warfare, where coordination, firepower, and political calculation mattered more than personal honor. As Yukita's warriors pressed their attack, they began to realize that the support they expected was not coming. Kobayakawa's forces remained motionless on their mountain, watching the battle unfold below them like spectators at a deadly entertainment. When desperate messengers reached Hidakaya, begging him to attack the Eastern Army's exposed flank, he responded with excuses, delays, and requests for clarification of orders that everyone knew were simply stalling tactics. Worse yet, other Western commanders began to reveal their true loyalties. Small Koide Yoshino actually turned his guns on his own allies, firing into the rear ranks of warriors who had trusted him with their lives. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had been fighting with desperate courage suddenly found themselves wondering if the warrior beside them was friend or enemy, if the next attack would come from the front or from behind. In the chaos and confusion, individual acts of heroism and horror unfolded like scenes from a nightmare. Shimazu Yoshihiro, commanding a relatively small force of Satsuma warriors, found himself trapped as the Western army collapsed around him. Rather than surrender or flee in disorder, he ordered his men to form up and charged directly through the center of the Eastern Army. A suicidal attack that he hoped would at least allow some of his warriors to escape with honor. The Shimazu charge became legend. 1,500 men, knowing they were riding to their deaths, spurred their horses directly into the massed ranks of Tokugawa's forces. They did not try to break through or win the battle. They simply aimed to die as beautifully as possible, while taking as many enemies with them as they could manage. Arrows filled the air like deadly rain. Spears thrust from all directions. Swords flashed and blood sprayed across the autumn grass. Yoshihiro himself fought like a man possessed, his katana cutting down enemy after enemy as his horse carried him deeper into the hostile army. When his mount was killed beneath him, he continued on foot, stepping over the bodies of his own men, pressing forward through wounds that would have felled lesser warriors. Somehow, impossibly, he cut his way through the entire Eastern Army and escaped, though only a handful of his men survived to follow him. Meanwhile, the main battle had devolved into a rout. As word spread that key commanders had switched sides, the Western Army's morale collapsed like a house built on sand. Units that had been fighting desperately began to withdraw, then retreat, then flee in panic as they realized the battle was lost and that staying meant certain death for no purpose. Ishida Mitsunari, the Western Army's nominal commander, watched his carefully planned campaign disintegrate in real time. He had positioned his forces perfectly, had superior numbers, and had been fighting for what many considered the righteous cause. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. This was not a battle between armies, but a political contest where the outcome had been decided before the first arrow was loosed. As his forces collapsed around him, Mitsunari faced a choice that defined the samurai ethos. He could flee, try to escape to fight another day, preserve his life for some future opportunity to restore his cause. Or he could die here on this field, among his men, accepting defeat with the dignity that the warrior code demanded. The Battle of Sekigahara lasted only 6 hours, but those 6 hours changed the course of Japanese history. When the killing stopped, thousands of warriors lay dead on the valley floor, their blood soaking into soil that would be remembered as the graveyard of the Sengoku period. The age of endless civil war was over, ended not by superior tactics or braver warriors, but by political calculation and the willingness of ambitious men to betray their allies when the price was right. Tokugawa Ieyasu walked among the dead as the sun set, surveying the field that had made him the undisputed master of Japan. He showed no joy in victory, no celebration at the destruction of his enemies. He understood better than most that this battlefield represented not just the end of one age, but the beginning of another, and that the skills that had won him this victory were exactly the skills that would no longer be needed in the peaceful world he intended to create. The summer of 1575 brought with it a confrontation that would forever change the nature of samurai warfare and signal the beginning of the end for the age of the mounted warrior. At Nagashino, two philosophies of war would clash with such violence that the echoes would resonate through Japanese history for centuries. On one side stood Takeda Katsuyori, heir to the greatest cavalry tradition in Japan, commanding an army that had never known defeat. On the other waited Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu, masters of innovation who would prove that tradition, no matter how glorious, could not stand against superior firepower and tactical adaptation. The Takeda clan had built their reputation on the backs of their horses and the strength of their warriors' arms. For over a century, their cavalry charges had been the terror of central Japan, mounted samurai in full armor, their lances lowered and their war cries echoing across battlefields, had shattered army after army with the simple expedient of superior courage and unmatched horsemanship. The sight of Takeda horsemen thundering across a field was enough to break the morale of most enemies before the battle even began. Takeda Shingen, Katsuyori's father, had been perhaps the greatest military commander of his generation. His strategies were studied, his victories celebrated, and his death in 1573 had been mourned by allies and enemies alike as the passing of a master warrior. But Shingen had also been pragmatic, willing to adapt his methods when faced with new challenges, careful to avoid battles where his strengths could not be brought to bear. His son possessed all of his father's courage, but little of his caution. Katsuyori had inherited an army that expected victory and a reputation that demanded he prove himself worthy of the Takeda name. When the opportunity arose to crush the upstart Nobunaga and his ally Tokugawa, Katsuyori saw it not just as a military necessity, but as a chance to demonstrate that he was truly his father's son. The siege of Nagakubo Castle had been proceeding exactly as planned. The small fortress, held by Tokugawa forces, was strategically important but weakly defended. Katsuyori's 15,000 warriors had surrounded it completely, and surrender seemed inevitable. But then came word that a relief force was approaching. 8,000 Oda troops and 3,000 Tokugawa warriors, marching to lift the siege. Any other commander might have withdrawn, avoiding a battle against superior numbers on ground he had not chosen. But Katsuyori saw opportunity where others might see danger. Here was his chance to destroy both of his primary enemies in a single battle, to demonstrate the superiority of traditional samurai warfare over the innovations and foreign weapons that Nobunaga had been introducing. What Katsuyori did not fully understand was the extent to which warfare itself was changing. Nobunaga had been one of the first Japanese commanders to recognize the potential of the arquebus, the matchlock firearm introduced by Portuguese traders, while other daimyo dismissed these weapons as curiosities suitable only for Ashigaru peasant soldiers. Nobunaga had been integrating them into his battle tactics, training his men in their use, and developing new strategies that maximized their effectiveness. The arquebus was not particularly impressive as an individual weapon. It was slow to load, inaccurate at long range, and unreliable in wet weather. A skilled archer with a traditional yumi could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took to fire and reload a single musket. But Nobunaga understood something that traditionalists missed. The arquebus's real power lay not in its individual performance, but in its potential for mass employment. As the two armies approached each other across the plains of Nagashino, the difference in their philosophies became immediately apparent. Katsuyori's forces deployed in traditional fashion, with mounted samurai in the front ranks, their colorful banners streaming in the wind, their armor gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them came Ashigaru, foot soldiers with spears and bows, ready to exploit whatever gaps the cavalry charge created. Nobunaga's army looked different, alien even. His 3,000 arquebusiers had been formed into ranks behind wooden palisades that they had constructed during the night. These were not samurai, but Ashigaru, peasant soldiers whose families had been farming rice a generation earlier. They wore simple armor, carried unglamorous weapons, and had none of the individual glory that defined traditional Japanese warfare. But they had been drilled endlessly in the loading and firing of their weapons, trained to work together as units rather than as individuals. The battle began at dawn with the thunderous crash of Takeda cavalry striking Tokugawa positions on the flanks. For a moment, it seemed as though traditional warfare might triumph once again. Takeda horsemen smashed through the first defensive lines, their lances finding gaps in armor, their horses trampling fallen enemies. The sound of their war cries mixed with the screams of dying men and the clash of steel on steel. But then Nobunaga sprung his trap. As the Takeda cavalry became entangled with Tokugawa forces, his arquebuses opened fire in carefully coordinated volleys. The first rank fired, then knelt to reload, while the second rank stepped forward and fired. Then they, in turn, knelt while the third rank took their place. By the time the third rank had fired, the first was ready again, creating a continuous storm of lead that swept across the battlefield like a scythe through wheat. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Horses, terrified by the thunder of gunfire and the smell of black powder smoke, reared and bucked, throwing their riders or carrying them away from the battle. Samurai who had never known fear suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they could not reach, weapons they could not deflect, and death that struck from distances where their courage and skill meant nothing. Individual acts of heroism became exercises in futility. Takeda Nobukado, one of Katsuyori's most trusted generals, led a desperate charge directly at the arquebusiers' positions. His horse was shot from under him within 50 yards of the palisades, but he continued on foot, running through the storm of bullets with his sword raised, determined to reach an enemy he could fight with honor. He managed perhaps 20 more steps before a volley cut him down. His body riddled with bullets, his weapon never having tasted enemy blood. The Takeda heavy cavalry, the pride of the clan and the terror of their enemies for generations, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight according to the rules they understood. When they charged, they were shot down before reaching their targets. When they withdrew to regroup, they were pursued by fresh volleys that cut down horses and riders alike. The very mobility that had always been their greatest strength became a liability as wounded horses carried their riders into killing zones or away from the battle entirely. Katsuyori himself led charge after charge, desperately trying to break through the deadly defensive line and bring his warriors into the kind of close combat where their superior training and equipment could tell. Time and again, he watched his best men cut down by weapons they had dismissed as beneath their notice, wielded by enemies they had considered unworthy of respect. The sound of the battle was unlike anything heard before on a Japanese battlefield. The traditional clash of steel was overwhelmed by the continuous thunder of gunfire, the screams of wounded horses, and the sharp crack of bullets striking armor. Smoke from the arquebuses drifted across the field like fog, making it difficult for commanders to see the state of the battle, adding confusion to an already chaotic situation. As the morning wore on, the futility of the Takeda assault became undeniable. Unit after unit had been shattered against the defensive positions, their survivors streaming back across the field in growing disorder. The carefully maintained formations of the morning had dissolved into clusters of desperate men trying to find some way to strike back at an enemy that seemed untouchable. Yet still, the attacks continued, because the alternative was unthinkable. To withdraw without achieving victory would mean admitting that the Takeda way of war, the traditions that defined their identity as warriors, were obsolete. Better to die gloriously in one final charge than to live with the knowledge that everything they had believed about warfare had been proven wrong. The end came suddenly. Katsuyori, seeing that conventional tactics had failed, gathered the survivors of his army for one last desperate assault. Every remaining mounted warrior, every samurai still capable of fighting, would charge together in a mass attack that would either break through the enemy lines or end the Takeda clan's military power forever. The charge was magnificent and terrible. Hundreds of horsemen, their armor battered, their banners torn, their faces set with the grim acceptance of men riding to certain death, spurred their mounts across the blood-soaked field one final time. They came not as a disciplined military unit, but as an embodiment of everything that had made the samurai legendary: absolute courage, unquestioning loyalty, and the willingness to die beautifully for causes that lesser men would abandon. The arquebusiers met them with their heaviest volley of the day. All three ranks fired simultaneously, creating a storm of lead so dense that the very air seemed to thicken with bullets. Horses and riders fell in heaps, some killed instantly, others wounded and screaming. creating obstacles that tripped and tangled the survivors. Those few who managed to reach the palisades found themselves facing fresh troops with long spears who had been waiting behind the guns, ready to finish what the bullets had started. When the smoke cleared, the flower of Takeda's army lay dead on the field. Katsuyori himself had survived, pulled from the battle by retainers who refused to let him die in a futile gesture, but his power was broken forever. Of the 15,000 men who had begun the day expecting victory, less than half would see another sunrise. The Battle of Nagashino marked more than just a military defeat. It announced the end of an era, the age of the mounted samurai, of individual combat between noble warriors, of battles decided by courage and skill with traditional weapons, was passing. In its place came a new kind of warfare where organization mattered more than individual prowess, where technology could overcome tradition, and where victory went not to the bravest but to the most adaptable. The winter of 1614 brought with it more than cold winds and bare trees. It carried the scent of endings, the weight of final reckonings, and the bitter knowledge that an age of legends was drawing to its close. At Osaka Castle, the greatest fortress in Japan, the last remnants of the Toyotomi clan prepared for a siege that would determine not just their fate, but the very nature of samurai. Honor in a world that no longer had room for their kind of glory. Toyotomi Hidari stood on the walls of his grandfather's castle, looking out over the vast army that had come to destroy him. At 21, he was the last legitimate heir to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the great unifier who had brought peace to Japan and built this massive fortress as a symbol of power that would endure forever. But forever had lasted barely 20 years, and now Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces stretched to the horizon like a sea of steel and gunpowder, ready to wash away the final obstacles to total shogunal control. The irony was not lost on those who understood history. Hideyoshi himself had risen from nothing, a peasant who had climbed to the heights of power through talent, ruthlessness, and an understanding of how to use both traditional samurai values and new military technologies. He had united Japan by defeating exactly the kind of independent castle holders his son now represented. The wheel had turned full circle, and the Toyotomi were about to be crushed by the same forces they had once wielded. But this was not simply a political conflict between rival claimants to power. The siege of Osaka represented a clash between two visions of what Japan should become. Hidori and his supporters represented the old way, where local lords maintained their independence, where military prowess could still elevate the worthy, and where the samurai class remained the dominant force in Japanese society. The Tokugawa represented centralization, bureaucracy, and a future where warriors would become administrators and the sword would give way to the pen. The castle itself was a monument to military engineering and aesthetic beauty. Its walls rose from the earth like extensions of the natural rock, their curves designed to deflect cannonballs, while their height made direct assault nearly impossible. Multiple baileys created killing zones where attackers would find themselves trapped between successive defensive lines, subject to crossfire from protected positions. The main keep towered above it all, its golden ornaments catching the winter sun, a defiant symbol of resistance to Tokugawa authority. Within those walls, an extraordinary collection of warriors had gathered for what they knew would be their final battle. Ronin, masterless samurai from across Japan, had flocked to Osaka like moths to a flame, drawn by the prospect of one last chance to prove their worth in combat. These were men who had lost their lords, their lands, and their purposes in the increasingly peaceful world the Tokugawa were creating. They came not just to fight for the Toyotomi, but to fight against a future that had no place for their kind. Among them was Sanada Yukimura, perhaps the greatest warrior of his generation, and certainly the most dangerous opponent the Tokugawa had ever faced. Yukimura was the son of Sanada Masajuki, a master strategist who had twice defeated Tokugawa forces when they were supposedly unbeatable. The younger Sanada had inherited his father's tactical brilliance and added to it a personal charisma that made men willing to die for him. His presence at Osaka transformed what might have been a hopeless last stand into something approaching a fair fight. The siege began not with the thunder of cannon, but with the subtler warfare of negotiation and psychological pressure. Tokugawa Ieyasu, now in his 70s and one of the most cunning politicians in Japanese history, understood that taking Osaka by storm would be enormously costly in both men and time. Better to achieve his objectives through diplomacy if possible, keeping his powder dry for battles where it would be needed more urgently. His first approach was deceptively generous. If Hidori would acknowledge Tokugawa's supremacy and accept a reduced domain in another part of Japan, he could live in peace and comfort as a minor lord. His followers would be pardoned, their lives spared, their service to the Toyotomi forgotten. It was an offer that any rational person would have accepted, and it revealed just how little Ieyasu understood the mentality of the men he was facing. The response from Osaka was exactly what anyone familiar with samurai psychology would have expected. Hidori would not abandon the castle his grandfather had built, would not accept reduction to the status of a minor provincial lord, and would certainly not legitimize the usurpation of what he considered his rightful inheritance. More importantly, the Ronin who had gathered around him had not come to Osaka to negotiate a comfortable retirement. They had come to fight, and they intended to do exactly that, regardless of the odds against them. When diplomacy failed, Ieyasu turned to the weapons that had served him so well at Sekigahara, and that the Tokugawa had been perfecting ever since. His army numbered over 200,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled in Japanese history. But more important than their numbers was their organization and equipment. These were not the diverse collection of clan forces that had characterized earlier conflicts. They were units trained to fight together, equipped with standardized weapons, and supported by the most advanced artillery in Asia. The Tokugawa had learned from European military innovations, importing not just cannons, but the entire science of siege warfare. Their artillery included massive guns capable of breaching even Osaka's formidable walls, mortar that could drop explosive shells into the castle's courtyards, and smaller field pieces that could break up any attempt at a sortie. More importantly, they had the logistical capability to sustain a siege indefinitely, with supply lines stretching back across half of Japan and reserves that could replace losses faster than the defenders could inflict them. The first winter siege of Osaka began in earnest in December 1614, and from the opening bombardment, it was clear that this would be a different kind of warfare than Japan had ever seen. The thunder of cannon fire rolled across the countryside like perpetual storms, each blast sending tons of stone and mortar flying from the castle walls. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to rubble in hours. Defenders who had thought themselves safe behind massive fortifications found themselves cowering in cellars as explosive shells burst overhead, raining down fragments of metal and stone. But the defenders of Osaka proved more resourceful than Ieyasu had anticipated. Yukimura had spent months preparing for this siege, not just gathering weapons and supplies, but developing tactics specifically designed to neutralize the Tokugawa advantages in numbers and firepower. His strategy was based on mobility, surprise, and the superior motivation of men who knew they were fighting for more than just military objectives. Instead of trying to match the Tokugawa artillery piece for piece, Yukimura focused on denying them the stable positions they needed for effective bombardment. Night raids struck at gun emplacements, destroying cannons and killing their crews before melting back into the darkness. Snipers picked off artillery officers, disrupting the coordination needed for effective siege work. Most audaciously, Small groups of samurai would emerge from hidden passages to attack supply convoys, burning gunpowder, destroying equipment, and generally making the besiegers' lives as miserable and dangerous as possible. These were not the set-piece battles that had characterized earlier samurai conflicts. This was guerrilla warfare, fought in the shadows and ruins, where individual skill and desperate courage could still tip the balance against overwhelming odds. The Ronin, freed from the conventional restraints of clan loyalty and social position, proved masters of this new kind of combat. They had nothing to lose except their lives, and they had already committed those to the defense of Osaka. The most spectacular of these raids occurred on New Year's Day, 1615, while the Tokugawa forces were celebrating the holiday, assuming that the defenders would respect the traditional truce. Yukimura led 3,000 picked men in a surprise attack on the main siege lines. They struck just before dawn, when the guards were drowsy and the officers were still sleeping off the previous night's sake. The assault was perfectly coordinated. Advance parties had already infiltrated the Tokugawa camp, cutting guy ropes on tents and setting fire to supply dumps. When the main attack came, it hit defenders who were confused, disoriented, and separated from their weapons and armor. For 2 hours, samurai armed with swords and spears fought hand-to-hand combat through trenches and gun emplacements, turning the methodical siege into a chaos of individual duels and small unit actions. Yukimura himself fought like a man possessed, his red armor making him instantly recognizable as he cut his way through enemy after enemy. Witnesses described him as moving like a demon, his katana striking so quickly that it seemed to be in multiple places at once, leaving a trail of severed limbs and opened throats in his wake. When a group of Ashigaru tried to surround him with their spears, he leaped over their weapons and landed in their midst, killing 4 men before they could react to his presence. But the raid's real objective was not killing enemy soldiers, though they did plenty of that. Yukimura's men had targeted the siege artillery, and in those 2 hours of chaos, they destroyed more cannons than the Tokugawa had lost in months of conventional warfare. Barrels of gunpowder were set alight, creating explosions that could be heard for miles. Cannon were spiked, their touch holes filled with metal spikes that made them useless until they could be completely Most importantly, the raid demonstrated that the siege would not be the simple matter of patience and firepower that Ieyasu had anticipated. When the attackers finally withdrew, they left behind a scene of destruction that shocked both armies. The methodical siege lines had been turned into a landscape of smoking ruins and scattered corpses. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical damage. The Tokugawa forces, who had been told they were facing a doomed garrison of desperate men, realized they were fighting some of the most dangerous warriors in Japan. Men who were not just willing to die, but capable of taking enormous numbers of enemies with them. The winter siege continued for months, but the initiative had shifted. Instead of simply waiting for starvation and bombardment to force surrender, the Tokugawa found themselves fighting a defensive war, constantly watching for the next raid, the next surprise attack, the next demonstration that the defenders of Osaka were far from beaten. Supply convoys required heavy escorts. Artillery positions needed constant guards. Officers slept with their swords beside them and woke at every unexpected sound. As spring approached, both sides realized that the situation had reached a stalemate that favored neither army. The Tokugawa could maintain their siege indefinitely, but they could not take the castle without losses that would cripple their ability to govern Japan. The defenders could continue their resistance, but they could not break the siege or force a decisive battle that might change the strategic situation. It was then that Ieyasu played his most subtle card. Rather than continuing the costly siege, he offered to negotiate a peace that would allow both sides to claim victory. Hidari could keep Osaka Castle and a substantial domain around it. The Ronin who had fought so bravely could be pardoned and allowed to return to their homes. All that was required was formal acknowledgement of Tokugawa supremacy and the filling in of the outer moats and defensive works that made Osaka so formidable. The terms seemed reasonable, even generous. They offered a way out of a conflict that could only end in massive bloodshed, regardless of who eventually won. But they also revealed Ieyasu's true strategy. He had no intention of allowing a potentially rebellious force to maintain a fortress that could serve as a rallying point for future opposition. The peace treaty was simply a way to accomplish, through negotiation, what he had been unable to achieve through force. The negotiations revealed the fundamental differences between the two sides. The Tokugawa representatives were politicians and diplomats, men who understood that power grew out of carefully crafted agreements and administrative control rather than martial prowess. They spoke of compromise, mutual advantage, and the benefits of peaceful coexistence. The Osaka delegation included warriors who had spent their lives believing that some things were more important than survival, that honor mattered more than practical advantage, and that a man's word, once given, was more binding than any written contract. They approached the negotiations with the same directness they brought to combat, seeking clear agreements that meant what they said and said what they meant. The peace treaty signed in the spring of 1615 appeared to end the conflict on terms both sides could accept. The outer fortifications of Osaka would be dismantled, but the castle itself would remain in Toyotomi hands. Both armies would withdraw, and Japan would return to the peaceful state that everyone claimed to desire. But Ieyasu had spent a lifetime studying the arts of war and politics, and he understood something that the defenders of Osaka had not fully grasped. In the new world he was creating, military power would flow from central authority rather than individual prowess, from bureaucratic control rather than personal loyalty, and from the ability to mobilize resources rather than the courage to face death. The treaty was not an end, but a pause, a breathing space that would allow him to complete the destruction of everything Osaka represented. Within weeks of the treaty signing, it became clear that the Tokugawa interpretation of peace differed significantly from what the Toyotomi had understood. The outer moats were not just filled, but completely obliterated, destroying defensive works that had taken decades to build. Tokugawa forces, rather than withdrawing, established permanent camps within sight of the castle. Most ominously, word began to spread that Ieyasu was demanding additional concessions that had never been part of the original agreement. The second siege of Osaka began in the summer of 1615, but this time there could be no pretense of negotiation or hope of compromise. Both sides understood that this would be a fight to the finish, a battle that would end either with the complete destruction of the Toyotomi or with such a Tokugawa defeat that their control over Japan would be shattered forever. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the plains outside Osaka Castle, as two armies prepared for the battle that would end the samurai age forever. June 3rd, 1615. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat and tension as 150,000 Tokugawa warriors spread across the countryside like a great black carpet of death, their banners hanging limp in the still air, their weapons glinting in the brutal sun. Within the castle's remaining walls, 15,000 defenders made their final preparations for a battle they knew they could not win. These were not just soldiers preparing to fight. These were the last representatives of a way of life that was passing from the world. Men who had chosen to die rather than adapt to a future that had no place for their values, their skills, or their understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Sanada Yukimura stood in the main courtyard, addressing the men who had followed him through the winter siege and who would follow him now into their last battle. His red armor had been cleaned and polished until it gleamed like fresh blood, his swords sharpened to edges so fine they could split silk dropped across the blade. But it was his words, not his weapons, that would be remembered by those few who survived to tell the tale. "Today we do not fight for victory," he told them, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Victory belongs to armies that have time, supplies, and reinforcements. We fight for something more important than victory. We fight to show the world that there are still men who value honor more than life, courage more than safety, and glory more than mere survival." The speech was not recorded by official historians, but its essence was captured in the poems and stories that would be told for centuries afterward. This was the moment when the samurai consciously chose legend over life, when they embraced the idea that how one died mattered more than whether one lived. It was a philosophy that would have been incomprehensible to the Tokugawa commanders preparing their methodical assault, but it was the driving force behind everything that was about to unfold. The battle began not with the clash of armies, but with individual acts of desperate heroism. Small groups of samurai, usually numbering no more than a few dozen men, would emerge from the castle and charge directly into the vast Tokugawa host, not trying to achieve any strategic objective, but simply to die as magnificently as possible, while taking as many enemies with them as they could manage. These attacks were militarily pointless, but psychologically devastating. Imagine being a Tokugawa foot soldier, part of an army so vast you cannot see its edges, equipped with the finest weapons and armor, supported by artillery that can reduce stone walls to rubble. You have been told that you are facing a beaten enemy, desperate men trapped in a hopeless situation. Then you see a handful of warriors in brilliant armor charging directly at your division, their war cries echoing across the battlefield, their weapons raised, their faces showing not fear but joy at the prospect of glorious death. The first of these charges was led by Kimura Shigenari, a young samurai who had spent the winter siege, proving himself one of the most capable defenders. At barely 25 years old, he had already earned a reputation as a warrior, whose skill with the sword was matched only by his tactical intelligence and his absolute commitment to the Toyotomi cause. When he rode out of Osaka Castle at the head of 300 picked men, he knew he would not be returning. The charge cut through the first ranks of Tokugawa troops like a sword through silk. Shigani's men had been carefully selected, not just for their fighting ability, but for their willingness to die without hesitation, and they fought with a desperate fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Their katana flashed in the morning sun as they carved through formations of spearmen, their horses trampling fallen enemies, their voices raised in death songs that had been composed during the long winter nights of the siege. But individual courage, no matter how magnificent, could not overcome the mathematics of warfare. As Shigenari's charge penetrated deeper into the enemy army, it was surrounded by fresh troops, isolated from any possibility of support, and systematically destroyed. One by one, the 300 warriors were cut down, their bodies forming a bloody trail that marked their passage through the Tokugawa ranks. Shigenari himself fought until his horse was killed beneath him, then continued on foot, his katana cutting down enemy after enemy until a spear thrust through his chest finally brought him down. Even then, he managed to kill his attacker with his wakizashi before collapsing, his life's blood soaking into the summer earth, his death adding another verse to the epic poem that the defense of Osaka was becoming. The psychological impact of these individual charges was enormous, but their military effect was negligible. The Tokugawa army was simply too large, too well organized, and too thoroughly prepared to be seriously damaged by even the most heroic individual actions. Each attack might kill dozens or even hundreds of enemies, but there were always thousands more to take their places, and the defenders' numbers were dwindling with every sortie. It was then that Yukimura made his decision to lead the final, ultimate charge that would either break the Tokugawa army or destroy the last organized resistance to their rule. He had perhaps 3,000 men remaining, the the survivors of a winter's fighting, the cream of Japan's masterless samurai, warriors who had proven their courage and skill in 100 desperate battles. It was not nearly enough to defeat the enemy army, but it might be enough to create a legend that would outlive them all. The preparation for this final charge was like a religious ceremony. Each warrior cleaned and prepared his weapons with the same care a priest might give to sacred implements. They wrote death poems, short verses that captured their final thoughts and would serve as their epitaph. They said farewell to comrades they had fought beside for months, knowing they would never see each other again after the next few hours. Yukimura himself had spent the night in meditation, preparing his mind for the perfect death that was the ultimate expression of samurai ideals. He was 49 years old, a veteran of campaigns across Japan, a master strategist who had twice defeated Tokugawa forces when conventional wisdom said such victories were impossible. He could have negotiated safe passage for himself, could have found some way to survive and fight again another day. Instead, he chose to die at Osaka because he understood that some defeats were more valuable than victories, some deaths more meaningful than lifetimes of compromise. The charge began just after noon, when the summer heat was at its most oppressive and both armies were beginning to show the strain of hours of fighting. Yukimura led from the front, his red armor making him visible across the entire battlefield, his personal banner flying above the mass of horsemen who followed him into what they all knew would be their deaths. 3,000 mounted samurai, the flower of Japanese martial culture, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their weapons honed to perfection, their souls prepared for death, thundered across the plain toward the center of the Tokugawa army, where Ieyasu himself waited behind ranks of guards and artillery. For a few moments, it seemed as though nothing could stop them, as though pure courage and desperate skill might somehow overcome impossible odds. The charge was magnificent beyond description. Horses' hooves drummed against the earth like thunder. War cries rose to the summer sky like prayers to the gods of battle. The sun caught the gleam of armor and weapons until the entire attacking force seemed to burn with its own inner fire. This was samurai warfare at its most perfect, most beautiful, and most doomed. But beauty could not turn aside bullets, and courage could not overcome artillery. The Tokugawa had prepared for exactly this kind of attack, had positioned their forces to funnel any charge into killing zones, where concentrated firepower could do maximum damage. As Yukimura's warriors approached the enemy lines, they ran into a storm of gunfire that was unlike anything seen before in Japanese warfare. Thousands of arquebuses fired in coordinated volleys, their bullets creating a wall of lead that no amount of courage could penetrate. Cannons loaded with grape shot turned sections of the charging force into red mist. Men and horses fell in heaps, their magnificent armor no protection against the impersonal violence of gunpowder weapons. The charge that had begun with 3,000 warriors was reduced to hundreds within minutes, then to dozens, then to a handful of survivors who somehow managed to reach the enemy lines. Yukimura was one of those survivors. His horse had been shot from under him early in the charge, but he had continued on foot, running through the storm of bullets with his swords drawn, dodging fallen bodies and dying horses, focused entirely on reaching the enemy and fighting the kind of personal combat that had always been the heart of samurai warfare. When he finally reached the Tokugawa lines, he fought with a fury that became legendary. Witnesses described him cutting through rank after rank of enemies, his katana moving so quickly it seemed like a blur of steel, his movements so fluid that he appeared to dance through combat rather than simply fight. For a few minutes, it seemed as though one perfectly trained warrior might actually be able to carve his way through an entire army through sheer skill and determination. But even legends must end, and even the greatest warriors are mortal. A spear thrust that he failed to dodge opened an artery in his thigh. A sword cut that he could not parry sliced through the muscles of his sword arm. Gradually, inevitably, wounds accumulated until even his perfect technique could not compensate for blood loss and exhaustion. His final moments were witnessed by Tokugawa retainers who would later write admiring accounts of his death. Even as he weakened, even as his life's blood soaked the ground around him, Yukimura continued to fight with grace and deadly precision. He killed his last opponent with a thrust that pierced the man's heart even as his own strength finally failed him. He died kneeling, his sword still in his hands, his face turned toward the castle he had died defending. With Yukimura's death, the last organized resistance at Osaka collapsed. The few surviving defenders either died where they stood or committed seppuku rather than face capture. Toyotomi Hideyori, the last heir to the great unifier's legacy, chose ritual suicide over surrender, ending his life with the dignity that samurai tradition demanded. The Battle of Osaka was over, but its echoes would resonate through Japanese history for centuries. In military terms, it was a complete Tokugawa victory, removing the last obstacle to their absolute control over Japan. But in cultural terms, it was something more complex. A moment when the samurai ideals of courage, loyalty, and beautiful death were crystallized into a form that would inspire future generations. Long after the political circumstances that created them had been forgotten, the katana was more than a weapon. It was the soul of the samurai made manifest in folded steel, a piece of craftsmanship so perfect that it transcended its function and became art. But the legendary swords that would define samurai culture were not created in a day or even a generation. They were the product of centuries of refinement, experimentation, and an obsession with perfection that bordered on madness. The greatest swordsmiths were not merely craftsmen, but artists whose medium happened to be deadly. Men like Masamune, who worked in Kamakura during the late 13th and early 14th centuries, approached sword-making with the intensity of religious devotees. Masamune would spend months preparing for a single blade, purifying his body and mind through fasting, meditation, and ritual purification. He believed that the spiritual state of the smith was transmitted directly into the steel, that a sword forged by a man in the proper frame of mind would carry supernatural qualities. The process of creating a katana was a ritual as much as a craft. The smith would begin by selecting his materials with obsessive care. The best swords required multiple types of steel: hard hagen for the cutting edge, softer shingen for the core, and medium kawagane for the sides. Each type of steel had to be folded repeatedly, sometimes hundreds of times, to remove impurities and create the complex patterns that would give the blade its legendary properties. The folding process was back-breaking work that could take weeks to complete properly. The smith would heat the steel to precise temperatures, judged not by instruments, but by the color of the metal in different lights. Then hammer it flat, fold it over, and repeat the process again and again. Each fold doubled the number of layers, so that a blade folded 16 times would contain over 65,000 layers of steel. The patterns created by this process were not merely decorative. They were visual proof of the blade's construction and indicators of its likely performance. But technical perfection was not enough. The greatest swords were said to possess their own spirits, personalities that reflected both the skill of their creators and the intentions behind their forging. Masamune's blades were famous for their restraint. They would cut only when absolutely necessary and would refuse to harm the innocent. His student Muramasa created swords with the opposite temperament, blades so bloodthirsty that they would drive their wielders to violence and madness. The testing of a new blade was often as dramatic as its creation. The formal process, known as tameshige, involved cutting through various materials to evaluate the sword's performance. The most prized targets were human bodies, usually those of condemned criminals or enemies killed in battle. A sword that could cut cleanly through multiple bodies with a single stroke was considered a masterwork, worthy of a place in a daimyo's collection. But swords were only part of the samurai's arsenal. The yumi, the Japanese longbow, was the primary weapon of mounted warriors for most of the Heian and Kamakura periods. These were massive weapons, sometimes over 8 feet long, made from laminated bamboo and wood, that gave them tremendous power and flexibility. A master archer could drive an arrow completely through an armored warrior at ranges that would challenge modern compound bows. The art of Kujitsu, Japanese archery, was considered the highest expression of samurai skill. It required not just physical strength and accuracy, but perfect mental discipline and spiritual harmony. The greatest archers spoke of becoming one with their bows, of releasing arrows without conscious thought, of achieving a state where the mind, the weapon, and the target merged into a single unified action. Training in archery began in childhood and continued throughout a samurai's life. Young warriors would practice shooting at increasingly difficult targets, stationary marks at various distances, moving targets pulled by ropes, and eventually other mounted archers in mock combat. The ultimate test was yabisami, horseback archery performed at full gallop, where the archer had to hit multiple targets while controlling his mount and maintaining perfect form. The arrows themselves were works of art. The shafts were carefully selected bamboo, perfectly straight and balanced. The fletching was made from specific feathers arranged in patterns that would stabilize the arrow's flight while creating the distinctive whistle that announced its passage. The points varied according to their intended use. Broad hunting heads for maximum damage, narrow bodkin points for penetrating armor, and ceremonial heads decorated with silver and gold for special occasions. For close combat, samurai relied on a variety of edged weapons beyond the famous katana. The naginata, a curved blade mounted on a long wooden staff, was particularly favored by warrior monks and some samurai infantry units. A skilled naginata fighter could keep multiple sword-armed opponents at bay, using the weapon's reach and the leverage provided by its long handle to deliver devastating cuts that could sever limbs or split armor. The kunabo, a massive iron club studded with spikes, was the weapon of choice for samurai who valued pure, destructive power over finesse. These weapons could weigh 20 pounds or more and required tremendous strength to wield effectively. A single blow from a kunabo could crush armor, shatter bones, and send even the largest warrior flying through the air. They were particularly effective against mounted opponents, whose horses could be crippled or killed with a single well-placed strike. But perhaps the most feared weapon in the samurai arsenal was not made of steel or iron, but of flesh and bone and years of training. The samurai themselves, through decades of practice and conditioning, became living weapons capable of deadly efficiency with whatever tools came to hand. They trained not just with swords and bows, but with improvised weapons, fighting techniques that could turn farming tools into instruments of death, and methods of unarmed combat that could kill or disable opponents in seconds. The training never stopped. Even veteran samurai who had survived dozens of battles continued to practice their skills daily, refining techniques that were already nearly perfect, preparing for the one moment when a slight edge in speed or timing might mean the difference between life and death. They practiced cutting exercises on bundles of bamboo and straw, their blades moving so quickly that observers could barely follow the motion, each cut precise and purposeful. Mental training was considered as important as physical conditioning. Samurai studied Zen Buddhism not for its spiritual benefits, but for its practical applications in combat. The meditative practices that helped monks achieve enlightenment also helped warriors achieve the mental clarity needed for perfect technique under the stress of mortal combat. A samurai who had mastered his own mind could fight without fear, react without conscious thought, and achieve the state of Mushin no mind, where action flowed directly from perception without the delay of rational consideration. The greatest warriors were said to possess Zanshin, a state of relaxed awareness that allowed them to perceive threats and opportunities that lesser fighters would miss entirely. A samurai with true Zanshin could sense an attack before it was launched, could read his opponent's intentions in the subtle shift of weight or the flicker of an eye, could respond to danger with actions that seemed to outside observers to be almost supernatural in their precision and timing. This level of skill was not achieved quickly or easily. The path of the warrior required absolute dedication, years of pain and frustration, and the willingness to sacrifice everything else in pursuit of martial perfection. Many began the journey, few completed it. Those who did became living legends, warriors whose skills were so far beyond normal human capability that stories of their exploits often sounded like myths rather than historical accounts. By the mid-17th century, the world that had created the samurai was disappearing faster than morning mist in the summer sun. The Tokugawa shogunate had imposed a peace so complete, so comprehensive, that the skills which had made the samurai class legendary were becoming not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous to the social order. Japan had become a land where administrators mattered more than warriors, where the ability to manage rice tax assessments was more valuable than the ability to take a human life with a single sword stroke. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The very success of samurai warfare, the complete military victory that had unified Japan under a single rule, had made samurai warfare obsolete. Peace was not just the absence of war, it was the enemy of everything that had given the warrior class meaning, purpose, and identity. Men whose fathers and grandfathers had lived every day knowing they might die in battle suddenly found themselves in a world where battles were forbidden, where the carrying of swords was regulated, and where the most important skills were reading, writing, and the intricate etiquette of bureaucratic procedure. The transformation was not immediate, but gradual, like watching a great tree slowly die from an invisible disease. The first generation of peacetime samurai still remembered the old ways, still carried themselves with the lethal grace of men who had killed and expected to kill again. They maintained their weapons, practiced their techniques, and told stories of the great battles that had made their reputations. But their sons grew up in a different world, one where martial prowess was admired as an abstract concept rather than valued as a practical necessity. The third generation barely understood what their grandfathers had been. They carried swords because tradition demanded it, but many had never drawn their blades in anger, never felt the weight of armor in battle, never experienced the clarity of thought that comes when survival depends on split-second reactions and perfect technique. They were samurai in name and social position, but not in spirit or experience. Yet even as the practical reality of samurai life changed beyond recognition, the ideals that had shaped warrior culture began to assume a different kind of importance. The code of Bushido, which had been a practical guide for men who lived and died by violence, became a philosophical system that influenced every aspect of Japanese society. The concepts of loyalty, honor, and beautiful death that had been forged in battle were transformed into principles that governed everything from business relationships to family obligations. The 47 Ronin, whose story became perhaps the most famous example of samurai loyalty in history, illustrated both the power and the tragedy of these transformed ideals. In 1701, their Lord Asano Naganor had been provoked into drawing his sword in the shogun's palace, a breach of protocol so severe that it required his immediate death by seppuku. This left his retainers masterless, Ronin with no purpose except the overwhelming obligation to avenge their dead lord. For nearly 2 years, these 47 men planned their revenge with the same meticulous care their ancestors had devoted to military campaigns. They scattered across Japan, taking humble jobs, pretending to have abandoned their warrior identities, while secretly gathering intelligence about their target and preparing for an assault that they knew would be their last act on Earth. The attack on Kira Yoshinoka's mansion was a masterpiece of planning and execution that demonstrated that the skills of the warrior class had not been forgotten even as their application had been criminalized. On a snowy night in December 1702, the Ronin struck with surgical precision, overwhelming the guards, searching the buildings methodically, and finally cornering their enemy in a storage shed where he had hidden like the coward they knew him to be. But the real drama lay not in the attack itself, but in its aftermath. The Ronin had achieved their goal, had demonstrated the kind of loyalty that defined the samurai ideal, but they had also committed crimes that the Tokugawa legal system could not ignore. They had planned and executed an unauthorized military action, had killed a court official, and had defied the government's monopoly on legitimate violence. The debate that followed their arrest revealed the fundamental tension between old and new values that was tearing Japanese society apart. Traditional samurai ethics demanded that they be praised for their loyalty and allowed to die honorably through seppuku. Modern legal principles required that they be executed as common criminals who had violated the peace that the Tokugawa had spent decades creating. The shogun's solution was typically Japanese in its complexity and ambiguity. The 47 Ronin were allowed to commit seppuku, acknowledging their status as samurai while still imposing the death penalty their crimes had earned. They died as heroes and criminals simultaneously, their fate reflecting the contradictions of a society caught between two incompatible value systems. Their story became legend, not because of what they had accomplished, but because of what they represented, the last pure expression of samurai, values in a world that no longer had room for such purity. They had chosen honor over life, loyalty over safety, and the approval of their ancestors over the convenience of their contemporaries. In doing so, they had demonstrated that the spirit of Bushido could survive even when the practical reality of samurai life had vanished. But for every story of perfect loyalty, like that of the 47 Ronin, there were dozens of other tales that revealed the psychological cost of the transition from war to peace. Many samurai found themselves unable to adapt to a world where their most important skills were useless, where the qualities that had made them valuable were now seen as dangerous or obsolete. Suicide rates among the warrior class soared as men, who had found meaning in the possibility of glorious death, discovered that peaceful death offered no glory at all. Some committed seppuku out of despair, unable to find purpose in a world that no longer valued what they had to offer. Others died in pointless duels, deliberately seeking out conflicts that would allow them to use their skills one last time before dying in something approaching the old tradition. The most tragic cases were perhaps those of the skilled warriors who became masterless through no fault of their own. Ronin who wandered the country, offering their services to anyone who would pay for them. These men had been raised to be weapons in human form, trained from childhood to kill and die for their lords. And suddenly they found themselves in a society where such weapons were not just unnecessary, but actively unwanted. Some became teachers, passing on their skills to students who would probably never use them in real combat. Others became bodyguards for merchants, using their reputations to protect men whose social status had once placed them far below the warrior class. A few became bandits or rebels, turning their skills against the very society that had made them obsolete. The most successful adaptation was perhaps the transformation of martial arts from combat training into spiritual discipline. The techniques that had been developed to kill enemies in battle were refined into methods of self-cultivation, ways of achieving mental clarity and physical harmony that had value beyond their original military applications. The tea ceremony, flower arranging, and other peaceful arts were influenced by samurai aesthetics, creating new ways for warriors to find meaning in a peaceful world. But even these adaptations carried within them the seeds of the old violence. The mindset that had been developed for mortal combat did not disappear simply because such combat was no longer allowed. It went underground, expressing itself in new forms that were superficially peaceful, but retained the essential characteristics of the warrior mentality: absolute dedication, willingness to sacrifice everything for perfection, and the belief that some things were more important than mere survival. The ghost of the samurai would haunt Japanese culture for centuries, influencing everything from business practices to artistic expression to the nation's approach to foreign relations. The ideals that had been forged in the crucible of medieval warfare would shape a modern industrial society, creating patterns of behavior and thought that would persist long after anyone could remember why they had originally been necessary. Even today, in a Japan that has been at peace for over 70 years, the influence of samurai culture can be seen in the dedication of craftsmen who spend lifetimes perfecting their skills, in the loyalty of employees who identify completely with their companies, and in the concept of honor that still shapes personal and professional relationships. The weapons may be gone, but the spirit they embodied continues to influence a nation that was shaped by centuries of warrior rule. The year 1877 marked the end of more than just a rebellion. It marked the final death of a way of life that had defined Japan for 1,000 years. The Satsuma Rebellion, led by Seigo Takamori, was the last time samurai would take up arms as a class. The final moment when the old ways of war would clash with the new technologies and philosophies that were transforming Japan from a feudal society into a modern nation-state. Seigo Takamori was himself the embodiment of the contradictions that were tearing Japan apart. He had been one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration, a leader who had helped overthrow the Tokugawa shogunate and restore imperial rule. But the Japan that emerged from this revolution was not the Japan he had envisioned. Instead of a modernized nation that still honored its samurai traditions, he saw a country that seemed determined to abandon everything that had made it unique in its rush to emulate Western powers. The reforms that followed the Meiji Restoration struck at the very heart of samurai identity. The exclusive right to carry swords was abolished, making every citizen equal before the law regardless of their birth or military training. The stipends that had supported the warrior class for centuries were converted to bonds and then gradually reduced, forcing men who had never worked for wages to find new ways to support their families. Most devastating of all, military conscription was introduced, creating an army of peasant soldiers who would replace the hereditary warrior class that had defended Japan since the Heian period. For many samurai, these changes represented not just political reform, but cultural annihilation. They had been raised to believe that their class held a special place in Japanese society, that their willingness to die for their lords and their mastery of the warrior arts gave them both privileges and responsibilities that ordinary people could not understand. Suddenly, they found themselves not just equal to farmers and merchants, but actually inferior in practical terms, since they lacked the skills needed to succeed in the new economy. The crisis came to a head in Satsuma, the southern domain that had produced some of Japan's finest warriors and had been Seigo's base of power since his youth. Here, more than anywhere else, the old traditions remained strong, and the new reforms were seen not as progress, but as betrayal. Young samurai who had grown up expecting to live as their fathers had lived found themselves facing a future where their swords were useless ornaments and their martial skills were meaningless accomplishments. The immediate trigger for the rebellion was relatively minor, a dispute over the establishment of military academies and the treatment of traditional weapons. But the underlying causes ran much deeper. touching on fundamental questions about what Japan was becoming and whether it was possible to modernize without losing the essence of Japanese culture. When the rebellion began in February 1877, it initially seemed as though the old ways might triumph one last time. Seigo's force of disaffected samurai, joined by students and sympathizers from across Kyushu, numbered over 20,000 men. These were not untrained peasants, but experienced warriors, many of whom had fought in the Restoration Wars and understood both traditional and modern military tactics. Their morale was high, their cause was clear, and their leader was one of the most respected figures in Japan. The government forces they faced seemed less impressive. The new imperial army was largely composed of conscripts, young men from farming and merchant families who had received only basic military training. They carried modern rifles and were supported by artillery, but they lacked the esprit de corps and combat experience that had always given samurai armies their edge. Many observers expected them to break and run when faced with a determined charge by veteran warriors. The early stages of the rebellion seemed to confirm these expectations. Seigo's forces moved rapidly through southern Kyushu, capturing government positions and attracting new recruits with each victory. The siege of Kumamoto Castle, a massive fortress that controlled access to the interior of the island, became a test of whether traditional siege tactics could still succeed against modern defensive preparations. For months, the samurai army surrounded the castle, employing all the techniques that their ancestors had used in countless sieges over the centuries. They built earthworks, positioned their artillery, and prepared for the kind of patient, methodical assault that had taken Osaka Castle 2.5 centuries earlier. But this was not Osaka in 1615, and the defenders were not relying solely on traditional weapons and tactics. The garrison of Kumamoto Castle was equipped with modern rifles, supplied by telegraph-coordinated logistics, and reinforced by troops who could be moved rapidly by the new railway system. More importantly, they understood that they were not fighting for personal honor or feudal loyalty, but for the survival of the new Japan that was still struggling to be born. As the siege dragged on, the fundamental problems of the samurai position became increasingly apparent. They had superior individual fighting skills and higher morale, but they lacked the industrial resources needed to sustain a modern military campaign. Their artillery was limited and their ammunition scarce. Their supply lines were vulnerable to government forces that could move by rail, while the rebels were limited to foot and horseback travel. Most critically, they were fighting not just a military campaign, but a war for the soul of Japan. And they were losing that war even when they won individual battles. Each victory demonstrated their martial prowess, but also proved that they represented the past rather than the future. Their very success made them appear to be obstacles to progress rather than defenders of valuable traditions. The decisive battle came at Shiroyama, a hill outside Kagoshima, where the remnants of Seigo's army made their final stand. By September 1877, the Great Rebellion had been reduced to fewer than 500 men, surrounded by over 30,000 government troops and facing artillery bombardment from land and sea. The night before the final battle, Seigo and his remaining followers prepared themselves with the same rituals their ancestors had used before Osaka, before Sekigahara, before countless battles stretching back to the dawn of samurai history. They cleaned and sharpened their swords, wrote death poems, and said farewell to comrades they had fought beside through months of increasingly desperate struggle. But this time, the preparation included something new. The knowledge that they were not just dying for their lord or their honor, but for the preservation of a way of life that the world no longer wanted. They were the last samurai in more than just military terms. They were the final representatives of values and traditions that would die with them on that hillside. The final charge at Shiroyama was both magnificent and futile. a perfect expression of everything that had made the samurai legendary and everything that had made them obsolete. As the sun rose on September 24th, 1877, Seigo Takamori led his remaining followers in one last attack down the slopes of the hill, their swords raised, their voices lifted in war cries that had echoed across Japanese battlefields for 1,000 years. They charged into rifle fire that cut them down like wheat before a scythe. They ran toward modern artillery that could kill dozens of men with single shells. They died as their ancestors had died, with courage and honor and absolute commitment to their cause. But they died knowing that their sacrifice would change nothing, that the world they had died defending was already gone. Seigo himself was wounded early in the charge, struck down by rifle bullets as he tried to reach the enemy lines. Rather than dying slowly from his wounds, he chose to end his life in the traditional manner, committing seppuku with the assistance of a faithful retainer. His death marked not just the end of the Satsuma Rebellion, but the end of the samurai as a military and political force in Japanese society. The aftermath of Shiroyama was telling in its restraint. The government forces treated the dead rebels with respect, recognizing that these men had died for principles they believed in, even if those principles were no longer compatible with Japan's future. Seigo himself was eventually pardoned posthumously and honored as a tragic hero who had been wrong but had been wrong honorably. But the real significance of the rebellion lay not in its military failure, but in what it revealed about the transformation of Japanese society. The new imperial army had proven that it could defeat even the finest traditional warriors, that modern training and equipment could overcome centuries of martial tradition. More importantly, the rebellion had demonstrated that the majority of Japanese people, including many samurai, were willing to accept the changes that modernization required, even when those changes meant abandoning much of what had defined Japanese culture for centuries. As we reach the end of our journey through the blood-soaked history of the samurai, we must ask ourselves what remains of these legendary warriors beyond the stories we tell and the movies we watch. The battles we have witnessed, the codes of honor we have explored, the magnificent deaths we have chronicled. What do they mean in a world where warfare is conducted by drones and computers rather than swords and courage? The answer lies not in the specific techniques of medieval combat, but in the principles that drove men to perfect those techniques, principles that transcend any particular time or culture. The samurai did not become legendary because they were skilled killers, though they certainly were. That they became legendary because they represented the human capacity to choose meaning over survival, honor over safety, and excellence over mere adequacy. Consider the mathematical precision of their training regimens, the decades of practice required to master a single sword technique, the willingness to devote entire lifetimes to the pursuit of martial perfection. In a world where most people seek the easiest path to their goals, the samurai chose the hardest path because they believed that the difficulty of the journey was inseparable from the value of the destination. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not simply a military code, but a comprehensive philosophy of life that addressed fundamental questions about human nature and social responsibility. How should an individual relate to authority? What obligations do we owe to those who depend on us? When is it appropriate to sacrifice one's own interests for the greater good? These questions remain as relevant today as they were in medieval Japan. The samurai's relationship with death was perhaps their most distinctive characteristic, and also the most difficult for modern people to understand. They did not seek death out of morbid fascination or suicidal depression, but because they recognized that the willingness to die for something greater than oneself was the ultimate expression of human freedom. A man who had truly accepted death could not be coerced, could not be broken, and could not be forced to betray his principles. This acceptance of mortality gave them a clarity of purpose that few people achieve. When every day might be your last, every action takes on heightened significance. Every relationship becomes precious, every moment of beauty becomes intense, and every choice reflects your deepest values rather than your temporary convenience. The aesthetic dimension of samurai culture, often overlooked in accounts that focus purely on combat, reveals another aspect of their legacy. The same perfectionism that drove them to master deadly arts also led them to create works of extraordinary beauty. Their swords were sculptures, their armor was art, and their ceremonies were performances that elevated practical activities into spiritual experiences. This integration of function and beauty, of practicality and transcendence, offers lessons that extend far beyond military applications. Whether we are talking about craftsmanship, relationships, or personal development, the samurai model suggests that excellence requires not just technical skill, but also an appreciation for the aesthetic and spiritual dimensions of whatever we undertake. The loyalty that bound samurai to their lords was not blind obedience, but a freely chosen commitment based on mutual respect and shared values. A samurai served his daimyo, not because he was forced to, but because he had decided that this particular cause and this particular leader deserved his complete dedication. This kind of loyalty, earned rather than demanded, created bonds that could withstand any external pressure. Modern organizations, whether military, corporate, or social, could learn much from this model. True loyalty cannot be purchased or commanded. It must be inspired by leaders who demonstrate that they deserve such dedication and who honor the sacrifice that loyalty requires. The samurai's approach to conflict resolution, while often violent in its ultimate expression, was based on principles that remained valuable in any competitive environment. They understood that victory required not just superior force, but superior strategy, better information, more complete preparation, and the psychological strength to execute plans under extreme pressure. Their emphasis on personal discipline as the foundation of all other abilities speaks to timeless truths about human performance. Whether the goal is military victory, artistic achievement, or professional success, the underlying requirements remain the same. The willingness to practice when practice is difficult, to maintain standards when standards are inconvenient, and to pursue excellence even when excellence offers no immediate rewards. Perhaps most importantly, the samurai demonstrated that it is possible to maintain personal honor and ethical principles even in the most brutal and chaotic circumstances. The code of Bushido was not a luxury that could be afforded only in peaceful times, but a necessity that became even more important when survival was at stake. Their example suggests that ethical behavior is not about following rules when it is easy to do so, but about maintaining principles when maintaining them requires genuine sacrifice. The samurai who refused to strike a defeated enemy, who kept faith with allies even when betrayal would be profitable, who chose death over dishonor, were not being naive or impractical. They were demonstrating that some things are indeed more important than mere survival. The battles we have explored, from the naval clash at Dananura to the final charge at Shirayama, were not just military engagements, but laboratories where human nature was tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. What we learn from studying these conflicts is not primarily about tactics or weapons, but about what human beings are capable of when they are pushed to their absolute limits. The courage displayed by warriors facing impossible odds, the loyalty maintained by retainers whose lords were already dead, the aesthetic sensibility that led men to compose poetry even as they prepared for battle. These characteristics reveal capacities that exist within all human beings but are rarely developed or expressed. The samurai were not superhuman, and they were not perfect. They were products of their time and culture, shaped by circumstances that no longer exist, and committed to values that often led to unnecessary violence and suffering. But they were also examples of what human beings can become when they commit. themselves completely to ideals that transcend their individual interests. Their legacy is not found in the specific details of their martial arts or the particular structures of their social system, but in the demonstration that it is possible to live with complete integrity, to pursue excellence without compromise, and to face death without fear when death comes in service of something greater than oneself. As the last echoes of Steel on Steel fade into history, as the final war cries are absorbed into legend, what remains is not the violence, but the choice to live by principles that gave meaning to the violence. The samurai showed us that human beings can choose to be more than merely clever animals competing for resources, that we can create codes of behavior that honor our highest aspirations, even when those codes make survival more difficult. In an age when traditional sources of meaning, purpose, and identity are being challenged by technological change and social upheaval, the samurai example offers not a template to copy, but a challenge to meet. They found ways to live with honor in their time and circumstances. The question they leave us with is whether we can find ways to live with equal honor in ours. The battles are over, the warriors are gone, and the age of the sword has passed. But the human capacity for courage, loyalty, discipline, and sacrifice that the samurai embodied lives on in every generation. Their greatest victory was not any military conquest, but the demonstration that these capacities exist, and can be developed by anyone willing to pay the price that their cultivation requires. The steel has rusted, the armor has crumbled, and the battle flags have faded. But the spirit they represented, the commitment to excellence and honor that drove them to perfect the arts of war and death, that spirit remains as sharp as ever, waiting for new warriors in new battles to take up the challenge of living lives worthy of the legends they might become. Tonight, as you reflect on these stories of steel and blood, of honor and sacrifice, remember that you carry within yourself the same capacities that made the samurai legendary. The question is not whether you have the potential for greatness, but whether you have the courage to pursue it, the discipline to develop it, and the wisdom to use it in service of something greater than yourself. The way of the warrior continues, not in the clash of swords, but in the daily choice to live with integrity, to pursue excellence, and to honor the best of what humanity can become. The battles may have changed, but the war for the soul continues. And in that war, we are all samurai, faced with the eternal choice between the easy path and the right path, between survival and honor, between mere existence and a life worth remembering. The last blade has fallen, but the legend lives on in every heart brave enough to embrace it.